починаю серію англомовних подкастів з моїми друзями та знайомими з різних світових країн. Це будуть політики, політологи, науковці, військові експерти, журналісти, медики, волонтери, люди різних професій. Ми будемо осмислювати війну очима європейців та мешканців Північної Америки, мешканців Азії, африканських країн, якщо вийде. І будемо робити це англійською мовою. Я зараз перейду на англійську мову. Hi, you're watching and listening to podcast. How do you think? We are starting the series of podcasts with my friends and acquaintances from around the world. These are going to be political experts, military experts, medical experts, diplomats, journalists, artists. We're going to try to comprehend the war through the eyes of citizens of the world. My first guest is Chris Gotowski, who's a friend of mine for many years, and he's from Poland. Chris, I'm happy to see you.
It's great to see you. It's been a while. I'm really happy to see you again, my friend.
We haven't seen each other in 6 years, I guess, which we just discovered.
Yeah, exactly. 2016, 2017 was the last time we saw each other. In Warsaw, as a matter of fact. And then before that, it was always on TV, basically, doing interviews.
That's true. So Chris is a great political expert who resides in Poland. And through Chris' eyes, we're going to try to understand and comprehend how Polish nation is experiencing this war right now. So Chris, I'm going to start with this. This is a question
Sure.
that I ask everybody during the wartime. How did you wake up to the war? What was happening to you?
It's quite a story. So honestly, I was getting really tense and really stressed out the days leading up to the war. I was getting really stressed out. And what happened was that, as a matter of fact, that night, when the war broke out, I had a horrible nightmare. I woke up with cold sweats, and I just checked my phone. Roughly, it was 5 a.m. Polish time, something along those lines. And that's when I saw the news that cities all across Ukraine were getting bombarded. Quite frankly, I felt really physically sick for the next couple of days. There's no joke right there. I felt really sick. I had a hard time eating for the first couple of days. I had a sleepless night afterwards. It was a very difficult time for me. I was really stressed out. So that's how I found out in the middle of the night, waking up from a nightmare, checking my phone. And it was a tough day.
And since this shock moved to a different state of mind,
yeah.
How did you start to react? What did you start doing?
Well, definitely, I was obviously following the news nonstop. Like I was the first few days that I was doing that constantly. Afterwards, I did naturally calm down. This is just human emotions. The first few days, I of course trying to stay busy as much as I can, doing what I can, with family stuff, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. But nonetheless, the first days and weeks, I was definitely pre-consumed with following the news. Still am, by the way. Still am checking the news very regularly, talking to different friends from Ukraine, from Poland, what have you, and discussing the situation on a really regular basis. And it's been definitely a big part of my life the past few months.
We all woke up in a few days after the war started, already seeing and knowing how Poland is absolutely generously opening its doors and borders to Ukrainians and to the country. How Polish citizens, not only the government, but I think it's vice versa, so the people started this, are
good
so
point
helpful.
you raised.
And I was wondering, Chris, how do you think what makes Polish people, Poles, be so helpful? What made them be so helpful in the first minutes since the war started?
I think there's a few things right here. I think first and foremost that there was already quite a lot of Ukrainians in Poland before the war broke out over the past handful of years since 2014, but even a little bit before that. I forget the exact statistics around. I think it was 1.5 million or before the war broke out. And a lot of Poles just actually knew personally Ukrainians. They had strong relationships. They worked with Ukrainians, what have you. So literally from just an emotional standpoint, where they know someone personally that's affected by this war, that they have family, for example, Instinct, I think, kicked in. That's number one. I think that's definitely a certain part right there. Number two, I think a lot of Poles actually could literally feel the situation to some extent due to historical background, right? Um, I don't want to give a whole history lesson about about all this stuff, but definitely Poland, uh, after the partitions in the late 1700s, was wiped off the map for 123 years. And Poles always longed for independence. They always fought for independence, and I think that's certainly a connection right there. Then later on, Poland regained independence after World War One, briefly for 20 years before it was invaded by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. This is something that oftentimes people in the West don't talk about. They don't talk about Molotov and Ribbentrop Agreement Pact that was to divide up Europe that way. So Poland again was fighting for its independence. And then after the war, Poland fell under the control of the Soviet Union. It was part of the Soviet bloc. It wasn't part of the Soviet Union, but it was part of the Eastern Bloc. And again, always kind of fighting for independence, the Solidarity movement in the 1980s. So I think that also plays a big part, where Poles actually, they could feel the situation from the Ukrainians. Obviously not to the extent of what's happening now, that's obvious. But because of historical background, because people in the family talk about what happened, grandparents, parents, what have you, there's certainly a lot of just sympathy and a kind of a feeling that we kind of get it. We certainly, at least we get it much more than a lot of people in Western Europe or North America or what have you. We feel it more. So that's definitely a big part of it as well. And again, this is Ukraine's our neighbor, so we have very close relations. All these factors contributed to this. But I have to say personally that I am really surprised to the extent, and as you said, Poles themselves, because sure, the government has done some good things, which is important, access to social security, healthcare, and what have you. These are important things. But it's the Poles who opened up their doors, their homes, brought Ukrainians in. So the Poles individually played a very, very important part. Of course, also NGOs, local governments, and what have you, charity organizations, etc.
And I think you're absolutely right. We definitely should not forget about not only Nazi but the Soviets dividing Poland. It's a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I've been reading a lot about that during the war. My interest to history became absolutely unimaginable. So what I was reading the kind of eyewitness written, I forgot the word in English. So the stories that were written by witnesses of Nazi and Russian invasion in Poland, in Polish territory, and Russians, Soviets basically. Some of them, by the way, might have been Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, different. But what's important? The Soviets behaved the way that the Russians behave right now, coming, plunging everything, raping women, killing kids, and this thing is repeating itself. This really was a surprise at the moment, but it's not a surprise anymore.
That's right. It's unbelievable when you hear people who survived the war in Poland, for example, talking about the Soviet occupation. These things that are happening right now, it's literally from diaries and stuff like that. People, talking about this stuff, stealing things, the raping, and it's like you're right. Absolutely, history is repeating itself in a shocking way. And the people, again, like you said, people oftentimes forget about that. There's the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact that all divided Poland. And Poland had actually the Nazi German occupation and the Soviet one. And literally from diaries, from people who talked about it, from pre-recording videos, actually, where you could see that happening. They talk about these things. Family members talked about, what happened in the war under Soviet occupation. And again, history, unfortunately, is repeating itself. We're seeing it right now. It's a tragedy. It's an absolute tragedy. But again, a lot of people actually in this part of the world, I don't want to say that, that they expected that for the Russians. It is a shock. But I think that they're less shocked than some people, again, in the West, which for them, they're absolutely in complete shock. But I think people here can remember actually, or it was passed down from the grandparents, parents who are telling these horrible stories, and actually historical events. There's huge massacres or what have you happening on the territory of Poland. Just to name one, the Katyn massacre, where 25,000 Poles were murdered. So these things, unfortunately, happened here, and we do see some things that are repeating. It's just awful.
Can I ask you this? So it's been 3 months plus already. How did your personal life has changed with the war? How did the war really affected your life or the lives of your close circle?
Well, I could say this, that my very close dear cousin, she took in Ukrainian refugees into her home personally. She's got a big family herself. She's got three kids, and her and her husband, three kids. And she took in, at one point, I believe there was, if I'm not mistaken, 9 or 10 Ukrainians in her home, refugees at one point. So I had other family friends and what have you who were taking in, were helping in Ukrainians and what have you. My personal life, I could say that over the past three months, it's been, a lot of stress. It's been a difficult time, just watching the news and what have you. But from a personal standpoint, yeah, just more stress, and like I said, family members helping out. Saw the compassion of Poles. It's very nice to see that how Poles are reacting right now. It's a beautiful thing that they're helping that way.
Do you see that the war brings the tiredness from the war? And are you personally tired of this war? And what is this tiredness? Like, how tired are you? From what exactly?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's a good point you raised. That I think that it's a normal, I think, effect. The first few days or whatever, people are absolute shock, and they're, like, their body's even a reaction. It's like almost like adrenaline, right? After a while, people do get used to it, but it's not good. It's not good that people actually get used to these situations where it becomes, I hope it's not going to be the situation soon, but it's just, a situation where you turn on the news and uh, 20 people, 30 people die, and people get accustomed to it. It would be horrible if that would be the case. But unfortunately, sometimes it is the situation where at the beginning people just have a little bit of shock value, adrenaline is rushing in, and they get actually tired of it. Am I tired of it? Of course I'm tired of it, because I want this whole situation to end, and for the best for Ukraine. I want Ukraine to do well here. But of course, it is tiring every day when you turn on the news and what have you, and you hear horrible stories too. It's just horrible stories. It's nonstop, like awful things. It can be very depressing.
Hmm.
So of course, it plays a
And
big factor, from a mental standpoint.
how do you think um, you would you personally and Poles could and would overcome this tiredness and find out the energy to help again? What should happen? Should more massacres in Bucha happen, or this should be something else?
No, I think that in general, the help is constant, right? So I think that in that respect, that it hasn't died down, but it is something that I worry about. That, let's say the war drags on a few more months, and then people will get a little bit tired of it, and it'll start actually having effect. Right now, I don't think it's having actually an effect on how Poles perceive the situation. They still want to help. They are helping, which is important. Also, coming back a little bit to politics, because you mentioned at the very beginning that the Poles are doing more individually, citizens, than the government, which is true. But it is very interesting that this issue here in Poland, the government, the opposition, pretty much everybody sees eye to eye in this. With maybe, like, exception of, some small fringe parties that are indifferent, let's say, or they don't, voice their opinion. But generally speaking, when you look at the main political parties, you get the ruling coalition, the United Right. You have Peace and Law and Justice and their coalition partners. You have the main opposition party, Civic Platform. You have PSL, the Polish People's Party. You have the left. You have Poland 2050. All those main parties, in this respect, everybody sees eye to eye that we have to help Ukraine, and all of them are pro-Ukraine. So that's actually, in Poland, we're very politically divided. It's huge divisions, to put it very mildly. This is one thing that people can agree on.
Hmm. I see. I like that you brought the political context. I also wanted to dwell onto that as well. We see that the Polish government is doing tremendous work in lobbying interest of Ukraine. Of course, we would understand that Poland is lobbying its own interest, which is completely fine because our interests and interrelated right now and they overlap. So I'm very happy about that. And I'd like to delve deeper together with you. What makes the Polish government to be so eager and aggressive in a good way into helping Ukraine get to the European Union, get the heavy armors, get the helicopters and MiG-29s and everything else? What do you think on political side makes it possible?
Well, I think a few things. I think that first of all, it's in the Polish national interest. So putting aside what people actually think, as far as compassion and what have you, but it's in the national interest of Poland for a safe, prosperous Ukraine. It's in the interest of Poland to have a stable neighbor, prosperous neighbor to continue trading. We want Ukraine to join the European Union. This is something that's in our interest. So putting aside, like I said, as far as the emotional component right here. Second of all, we do see what President Zelensky said on many occasions too, that it won't end in Ukraine, right? If, for example, Russia's not defeated in Ukraine. And that's a very important point. I think that the Poles do take that very seriously, and we know that too. We know this, that from a historical background, we know that if, for example, a dictator is not stopped, they'll go for further. So it's in Poland's interest for Ukraine to be able to defend itself, and ultimately for Ukraine to win too. So those are 2 points, and also even the third point, just as far as compassion and what have you. Like I said, that Poles could actually feel this, and again, even from a political standpoint, where the vast majority of Poles want to help Ukraine and they believe the government should help Ukraine. This is actually driving the political parties and the government to help Ukraine. And this is actually, by the way, which is very different from the situation in 2014. Whereas in 2014, a lot of the governments, for example, in Europe, in North America, what have you, they were kind of, trying, to make an effort to help, albeit not really well. But okay, there were some mild sanctions, there was some help. But again, it came from the governments. But now this time around, it actually came from the people in the societies, right? They were kind of also pushing the government too. This is a completely different scenario. So I think those are some of the reasons why in Poland there's such overwhelming support for Ukraine at the moment.
And what I also mentioned, and what we see, that you're helping not only to Ukraine and to Polish interests, of course, but you are literally very much against Russia in many dimensions.
Yeah.
No Russian business. Well, mostly no Russian business.
Yeah.
Embargo on oil and gas.
Yeah.
Stop doing business with Russia. Sanctions, Ukraine to EU. Defensive collaboration between Ukraine, Poland, Baltic states, and Great Britain.
That's right.
What makes your country and the Poles in general not to be in favor of Russians?
Well, I think again it comes from a historical background right there, from a historical context. That when Poland, for example, when communism collapsed in 1989, every successful government in Poland at that point, the goal was to get as far away from Russia as possible. That's the truth. That was absolutely the truth, and we weren't naive.
So every government really wanted to go away as far as they could from Russia.
From 1989. That's right. So since 1989, when Poland had the first, in 1989 was the first semi-free democratic elections, because it was only partially, there was only part of the parliament that was allowed to have free elections. But Poland regained its independence and became a democratic state. Since then, we had many different governments. We had left-wing governments, we had center-right governments, we had strange coalitions and what have you. But at the beginning, from 1989 till Poland joined the European Union, or first NATO in 1999, and then the European Union in 2004, seriously, every single government, that was the goal. And it was the goal of every single government to actually join the Western alliances, join Western institutions. This was completely broadly supported by the population as well. So in that respect, this was something that Poles wanted. They wanted to get away from Russia. I think it came from, a few things. First of all, they didn't want to have a threat from historical issues, but also something that's very interesting too, strictly speaking, also from an economic standpoint. This is something that kind of, frankly, a little bit irritates me when you see it in the media and what have you, when the journalists say that Ukraine, or they say maybe Moldova, they give some examples, Georgia, they want to join NATO and the European Union, but they don't give reasons why. And that's the thing what drives me insane. Like they don't explain why. And of course, the European Union joining, it's not rocket science. The countries would join the European Union, they become ultimately wealthier as time goes on. It's not rocket science. So Poland wanted to get away from Russia for those reasons, from security reasons, historical background, and strictly speaking, from even economic standpoint.
You just brought me to the point where I want to chip in this type of topic. Like, is prosperous Ukraine really a good thing for Europe?
For Europe?
When the war is over,
yeah,
and Ukraine is either in the EU or on the way to the EU, and the money is fueled to the modernization and rebuilding of Ukraine, Ukraine will become way more stronger. Our voice will be way more stronger. And I hear and read, I live in Austria, and I talk to people locally. There is a fear that Ukraine will become a major player together with Poland on the European scene. So let's just assume Germans and French are in a way are aware of this and afraid, so they will lose like majority of control or influence. Do you see this as a real threat?
Honestly, I never thought about it from that standpoint, to be honest with you. That's an interesting point right there. Maybe there's some elements of that as well. I think certainly Poles don't feel that way, but it's hard for me to understand what Germans or the French are thinking. But I could definitely say that's clearly not the standpoint of Poles. It's not the Baltic states clearly don't think that way as well. I'm not sure what the French or the Germans are thinking, but it is also interesting how they're the not the least supportive. Let's put it that way. They are, of course, helping. It's true, but certainly not to the extent as other countries like Poland, the Baltic states, the UK, US, and what have you. So maybe there's some truth in that. It's hard for me to tell, to be honest.
Understood. And the way that you are helping us, how big is the extent? How far can you go? Do you think? Like, how big of the help you still can get to us? Can bring us?
Well, I mean, Poland as a country, sure, we could still take in more refugees. Although, as even Rafał Trzaskowski, he's the mayor of Warsaw, he was saying that we are getting stretched. So that we do expect that other countries, like in the West, like France and the Netherlands and what have you, Germany, they'll be able to help a little bit more. But to what extent can we help? I think what Zelensky was saying, President Zelensky, as the foreign minister of Ukraine, was saying as well. Weapons, weapons, weapons. I think that's something that we could do more of. We are doing a lot, but I think we could do a little bit more of that as well. But I think as far as the European Union, I think the main thing right now is the sixth round of sanctions, which is taking a really long time, this package. Yeah. This one will be namely the oil embargo. It's taking way too long. Poland's pushing for it big time. It looks like only one country is really blocking it. That's Hungary, from what I understand. That stated, I was just actually reading an article not long ago in Bloomberg. They're saying that the European Union might make some exemption that there'll be land-based oil through pipelines will be allowed for the time being, but any kind of transport through sea with oil will be banned. So in this respect, it will allow basically Hungary to continue while other countries will ban it. But again, let's hope that passes. But again, I think as far as Poland, yeah. So even pushing for more sanctions aggressively in the European Union, which we've been doing, and we should continue doing.
You guys have been very helpful in many domains, but there is a domain that is very peculiar. It's given us fighter jets, MiG-29, that Poland would say they would give, but they would not. And we in Ukraine, as general population, we of course, as we don't know the drill and everything and included on the deal, we would of course say, we would be on high alert saying, oh my God, Poland is not supporting us anymore. So I'd like to elaborate that. And if you know what to say about it, please do.
Honestly, this is a strange case. This whole situation with these fighter jets. There's been a lot of confusion, which, by the way, it looks really bad. This whole thing, the way it was played out. So my understanding was that Poland wanted to give these jets at the same time then the United States would give Poland make up for the newer jets. And then what Poland would do with these newer jets, I'm not sure. Would they keep it? Maybe later on give it to Ukraine? I'm not sure. There's been a lot of confusion to that, and it's a really shame that they've actually haven't done more with this. And not only Poland, but just in general, the Western allies regarding the Air Force. This is, in my opinion, looks really weak. They talk about it out loud and then they kind of backtrack. You don't do that in front of Russia. That looks really weak. In general, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was saying that in general, like some of these situations where a lot of things are discussed openly and then they're backtracked, that looks horrible. Like, I don't understand why they can't do it, behind closed doors, reach some sort of an agreement, and then announce it. But in this case, sometimes with the weapons deliveries, they're announced first, and then there's some confusion. And there's been actually a lot of confusion with German weapons too. Like, and there's ongoing confusion. They say they'll send weapons, then they say they won't. Then they say they'll send some weapons, and it's really confusing. And I think a lot of this stuff should be kept behind closed doors, kept from the public. And then when the good news happens, then they release the good news. Not saying giving false hope, false expectations, and then nothing happens from it. So this whole situation with these planes, I don't know exactly fully what was going on. I know there was a lot of confusion, a lot of stuff was made public. Then I remember at one point also that the states also were a little bit annoyed with Poland with this situation too.
And I was very curious from your eyes, and all this is playing out live. I mean, the war is ongoing. It's the only war that we see live. Well,
Yeah.
the Syrian conflict and the Syrian war is almost live, was almost live, and is almost live. But the Ukrainian is super live, and it's all ongoing. And your country is in the middle of it in a way, and you have relations with various stakeholders, internally and externally. How Poland and Polish position is changing and moving in the geopolitical world? What do you see?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that actually Poland's position has gotten much stronger in that respect, even though for years it was actually in decline as far as its position in Europe and geopolitically. It was constantly, conflicts with the European Union, which they still are happening, by the way. This is far from over. But this whole situation that Poland's at the forefront, taking in the brunt of the refugees, so it's 3.5 million refugees right now. Poland's at the forefront of sending weapons. It's going through Polish territory, right? So the weapons that are coming from NATO countries and European Union goes through Poland and Romania, primarily those countries right now. I think also maybe through Slovakia a little bit, but nonetheless, primarily from Poland. So in that respect, yes, of course, Poland's position has increased a lot, and in general, from strictly speaking, from a PR standpoint, it's gotten much better. People are surprised around the world. The compassion polls are showing regarding refugees, especially how this wasn't always the case. In the past, when there was the relocation of the refugees coming in from the Middle East, it worked a little bit differently back then. Polls weren't too keen on that. So in this respect, Poland's image has increased a lot, and Poland's standing definitely has increased over the past few months. That, like I said, for a good few years, there was problems, and not only like within the European Union, but also there was some conflicts and a little bit tension with the United States too, because the ruling party was about to ban the leading opposition news channel, TVN, and they actually passed it through Parliament. It was rejected by the opposition-controlled Senate, and then the Sejm, the Parliament, the government-controlled Parliament, bypassed it. So they actually voted against the Senate and had the majority votes to do that. So they passed it, and it was actually just left for the president to sign. And this was actually right around Christmas, when there was already 150,000 Russian troops on the border. And the United States weren't pleased with that whole situation. This is America's biggest investment in Poland. Thank God, and thank God the president vetoed that law. But there was some, so with the European Union there was tensions with the Biden administration. There was tension because with the Trump administration, the ruling government had really good relations. With the Biden administration, there was a little bit not as smooth. But in general, this actual situation of TVN was even an issue under Trump, because this is America's biggest investment. They didn't like that whole thing. So, but again, the president Duda vetoed it. So that kind of the relations with the United States are strong again. With the European Union, they're much better. Let's put it that way. This whole situation with the judiciary in Poland is still an issue, so it hasn't been actually fully solved. Far from it, to be honest. But it's true that Poland's position in Europe right now is much stronger than it was. I think Poland's image, I think you could say, has recovered from some of the negative publicity that it received over the past 7 or 6 years.
Yeah.
So it's definitely gotten better over the past few months. That's true.
If you Google Poland right now, you receive really good public response. So PR is great for Poland right now.
That's right.
And I was wondering, this is the current situation, but how do you see this might play out in future? That the fact that Poland establishes itself as a more solid player, how this could and should, you as a Pole, how do you want it to play out?
Well, I think it's good that that Poland is getting stronger on the international stage. I think that it's in the interest of actually countries in Central Eastern Europe, former communist bloc countries, that have a country have a strong position in the European Union. So I hope that actually Poland's position gets even stronger. I think that's, if you look at it, for example, Poland is one of the largest countries in the European Union. With the UK that they left with Brexit, Poland really had a big opportunity to play a big role then. But again, because of all the conflicts of the European Union, that didn't come into fruition. That stated, right now is certainly a key moment. So that's why I really do hope that this whole situation with the judiciary, this conflict with the European Union, I hope that the government here solves it. There was some legislation passed even yesterday, as a matter of fact, to kind of water it down, but it's very cosmetic. It's nothing real. I think the European Union will still persist this issue with Poland. That stated, I think that Poland's position is a growing one. I think Poland's economy is very strong over the past years. It's got nearly 40 million inhabitants. So in Europe, one of the bigger countries, it certainly should play a bigger role.
I was wondering, Chris, you mentioned a few minutes ago that the cities are stretched with Ukrainians, temporarily displaced or already refugees. And I'm really curious on in these 3 months, what you and your friends and your colleagues and the government itself and the citizens have mentioned about the way that you guys are accommodating Ukrainians. What has changed? How did this evolve into what was it in the beginning and what is it now?
Well, if anybody's been to Warsaw, they'll actually probably be very surprised that you don't see, refugee camps or, like tents. Sometimes you see this situation in the Middle East when there's a refugee crisis. This hasn't happened at all, right? Yes, maybe there was a little bit, for example, in the train stations, from my understanding, the National Stadium a little bit. But again, Poles reacted really quickly. They brought them into Ukrainians into their homes. So this is an ongoing thing. But as far as Polish cities being stretched, I think, for example, that there will be a bigger movement to actually start building some, more residential buildings or some temporary housing, because actually this is actually an issue for Poles as well. It was already happening before the situation, before the war broke out, that there was a problem with housing to begin with. Real estate was expensive. And now there's a huge problem on the rental market, which is really, really unique. Now, as I mentioned to you also before, I work a little bit in real estate. And right now we're seeing huge issues in the rental market, which is very different. So this is a huge change that would emerge over the past few months, because back before that, yes, people wanted to buy real estate. That was the main thing in big cities in Poland. But now we have a situation where it's kind of Poles are hit with a little bit of a double whammy. So on the one hand, interest rates have gone up a lot. So Poles in many ways can't get a mortgage, right? So they want to rent. So they're forced into renting, right? So the rent prices were already going up now. Now at the same time, there's more and more Ukrainian refugees coming in. So there's a huge problem on the rental market where the rent prices are skyrocketing. So that's something that's changed a lot fundamentally. So in the past 3 months, rent prices have increased by 40% in Warsaw.
40%.
40%. Yeah.
Wow, man.
Yeah. So to answer your question, what can be done, and what were some things we're noticing. So that is something that's definitely being noticed for Poles, and I think the government, the local governments, there's something that has to be changed here regarding real estate. I know that in Rzeszów, it's a town close to Ukraine, Poland's eastern border. I think at one point there was the population increased by, if I'm not mistaken, by 50%, if I'm not mistaken. So they have a huge housing problem right there. I know they were building already some temporary housing units, but I think if this the war drags on, which probably will, if there'll be more Ukrainians coming here, I think that there has to be something done regarding real estate, because that's actually something that it's becoming a problem. And like I said, this was already becoming a problem before the war, because the Poles were starting to get priced out because of interest rate hikes. So people were kind of more forced into renting. But now there's a huge problem on the market as far as renting is concerned.
So this is a topic to follow, because there's no solution yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when I was helping a client to organize a relocation to Poland, when the first month of war has passed, I have collected information on 5 Polish cities and the rental, and I was trying to check the rental units, and I called to each of the city, to real estate agents to each of the city, and they told me, listen, we cannot accommodate 60 families. It's too much.
Yeah.
We can help. There's no room. And I was shocked. It's a scary situation, because if more Ukrainians are coming, or those who are not right now settled in the houses of just local citizens, who at some point will have to say, sorry, but we need to live and move on, so please move out and find a place to live. There will be no place to live physically. So I'm happy to hear that there is something happening, but we need to follow it closely.
Very slowly. But the people, they're talking about this, and I know in Rzeszów there's this kind of temporary housing units that I saw, but in Warsaw nothing's happening yet. This is certainly an issue that I think is going to be playing out for the next few months. Because imagine, for example, if in the next few months rental prices increase by 40% or something like that, it's going to be really, really affecting a lot of people. So
this affects not only Poles, but Ukrainians and visitors and expats and everything. Okay.
Absolutely.
And number 2, how do you reside in Warsaw? How do you feel and see the war affects other parts of life, not only the rental thing, the food, the services, gas, fuel?
Yeah. Well, in general, this is something that actually is even before the war. The inflation was rising significantly, but now it's increasing even more. So this is a big issue for the next, I'd say, certainly the next year, is the inflation rate. So inflation right now is roughly around 12.5%, 12.3%, if I'm not mistaken. So it's increased dramatically over the past handful of months. Like I said, this was already increasing before the war started, but it's only increasing even sharply now. So this is something that's going to have a big effect for Poles. And as you said, even the gas prices and what have you, food prices, they're going up. This is very noticeable right now. So not only the rental market, as we talked about, but generally speaking, day-to-day life is getting more expensive.
And when you say more expensive, and it becomes more expensive, I can see it here even in Austria. But how expensive? From 1 to 100%. How more expensive is your personal life if you compare it to 3 months ago?
That's a good question, because it's hard to say exactly what percentage, but I could say that generally speaking, everything went up. For example, electricity bills, things like that, it went up substantially. When you go shopping in the local stores, it's noticeably getting more expensive over the past handful of months. So this is something that's going. As far as the percentage, it's very difficult for me to say. I could say that it's 12.3% inflation, but again, inflation covers many different things. When you look at food prices, it's substantially more than that. But as far as for me, I could say that yes, like I've noticed that it's gotten much more expensive for the bills in particular. Just everything went up, everything, all kind of prices went
And
up.
and this is the effect right now. This is a current live effect that you see that is ongoing right now. And if we see the delayed effect in 3 to 6 months in Poland, what do you predict? What do you see is going to happen?
Well, that's an interesting question because I would assume that if prices keep increasing, inflation is going to be increasing. I assume there's going to be more pressure on the government. So there could be a situation where the government will be losing some support. That stated, their support has been remarkably steady, regardless of what happens. But I think that yes, people, it's natural human nature. When people start noticing that it's more expensive, bills are getting higher. They oftentimes blame the government, even if it's not the government's fault. But this is just a natural effect. So I think that could be one thing that starts taking place in the next half a year, where people start getting actually literally worried about their finances. Inflation is going to be continue to rise. Again, the big one is also those interest rate hikes too, because that means that people will have a very hard time buying a flat, and we're already seeing that too. That just in general, the mortgage market has been significantly in decline right now, and it could come to literally a complete halt. I think in the next handful of months, because right now, because the interest rate is right now, the government one is 5.5%. I think 5.25. I think, but there we calculate also in the mortgage market with something called the VBOR. So it's usually around 0.5%, 1% higher. So say it's like around 6.25%. But then also in Poland, the banks when you get a mortgage, they introduce something called margin in Polish. It's called, so like something along with like bank margins. So they add on a few percent. So if you're looking at 9% or something like that in mortgages, 8.5, 9, it's probably going to be higher soon. It's going to really slow down the market, especially that it just not long ago was used 1%, mortgages, 1.5, 2%. So significant increases. So that will also have a huge effect on polls in the coming months. So inflation, interest rate, those are big things I think to look out for in the next 3, 6 months, 9 months.
Now I'm going to switch to military topic.
Sure.
I think it's important. So I'm probably not going to open up information if I say that there's a lot of movement. There was a lot of movement of NATO army and Polish forces around the border, in forests and everywhere, and we saw it with our eyes. And I'm very curious on how you, Chris Gotowski, observing and seeing this war as a third world war already, or just as a Russia-Ukraine war. And if you see it, well, okay, tell me the thought, and then I'll go on.
Yeah. Definitely this is something that I think worries a lot of people, especially here in this region that we're seeing. So we take the situation very seriously. That stated, you mentioned the NATO forces in Poland and in the Baltic countries. There's more and more here. Poles, I think that they do realize that being a member of NATO does give that element of protection. Now, I don't want to play games of what if. I don't even want to go there, right? But I think that for a lot of Poles, this is actually like a feeling of some sort of element of security. So we do like it that we have NATO troops here presently. If anything, we want more, right? But as far as the concept of World War III, I hope to God that that's not the case. I hope that it's clearly that it won't spread. What I do worry about is not spreading as far as NATO getting directly involved, but I worry that, for example, maybe Moldova, Russia could do something in Moldova and kind of avoiding the NATO membership countries and targeting those kind of countries what are NATO. That's something I think that we should really pay close attention to.
I understood. In my thinking, the World War III is already ongoing. Why? Few things. You guys are giving us guns. You guys are giving us ammunition. You're giving us money. You're helping us with resources already. So it's a proxy war in a way.
That's right.
And so out of this, I make a conclusion that this is an ongoing global conflict, global war. But it's so hard for Europeans to state it out loud.
Yeah, yeah. I agree with what you're saying that this is. You could even go back in time a little bit. And since 2014, right, when Russia annexed Crimea and started the war in Donbass, already then the dynamics changed fundamentally, and we could see this. There was the spying, the hack attacks, of Russia on the West. Constantly getting involved in politics, funding far right parties, far left parties, kind of creating this mess, right? So this has been an issue that definitely for some years now. But I think you're right to a certain extent that this is a more of a global conflict. Certainly, a West versus Russia issue that's more than an issue, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a full out war, obviously. But you're right. The Western arms are coming into Ukraine on a massive scale. The United States passed the 40 billion, as far as helping Ukraine with weapons sales. That's huge. That's massive. You have to bear in mind, for example, that some of U.S.'s top allies, like the state of Israel, they get something like $4 billion a year, right? So they have to put that into context. That the 40 billion is really massive. And again, by the way, this is interesting too. I mentioned something before that this is an issue that in Poland, both the government and the opposition see eye to eye. It's very interesting how in the United States, which is also unbelievably divided country right now, right? The Democrats and the Republicans, huge divisions. Yet when it comes to this, generally speaking, they see eye to eye. Yes, there are some Republican senators that are more of the part of the Trump camp, or a little bit more of the how to say it, isolationist. Let's say a small group that I don't think they voted for that bill. I think it was something like 12 Republicans. I think didn't vote for that. But again, generally speaking, the United States as well. This issue, the Democrats and Republicans can see alike. And same with in Poland, right? But yeah, absolutely, you're right that this is a far greater conflict than just I say that in quotation marks, Ukraine versus Russia. This has involved the vast majority of certainly the countries in Europe, North America, Australia, what have you, Japan, South Korea, what have you, neutral Switzerland, right, which is stays out of all this kind of stuff historically. Also impose sanctions. Although maybe not all of the sanctions so far, but they also are imposing sanctions. That's a huge change.
Thanks on that and clarifying that. We have about half an hour, maybe a bit less, so I'll move on. We talked on how you guys are helping Ukrainians localize and be accommodated in Poland. And what has changed in how you deal with Russians, regular Russians, not the politicians or warriors, but regular Russians? How you personally are dealing with Russians now, and how do the Poles deal with Russians right now?
Well, I mean, that's a tough question to answer because when we do see the approval rating of Putin in Russia, if we do see the approval rating of the war, now it's shocking. Now we don't know to what extent those are real numbers because it is a dictatorship there. I do treat some of these opinion polls with a grain of salt. It's hard for me to imagine that. I hope those aren't real statistics, but nevertheless, it is worrisome that there is still broad support from Russians for this war. Again, to what extent, I don't think we'll ever fully know. They do have strict laws there as well that you can't even call it a war. You can't call it an invasion. You could be threatened with jail time. So I would be very cautious with those 75% or whatever those figures are. But nonetheless, it's true that there is a lot of support, and we in Poland that certainly worries us. But again, it's something that I think we look at it a little bit differently than maybe our friends in Western Europe or North America, because again, we know Russia better, so this doesn't come to us as a full shock. But like I said, I would be suspicious of those numbers. But nonetheless, that is very concerning. Also, very concerning too how there wasn't, for example, too many protests of Russians. I don't mean in Russia. I understand that because it's very difficult for them to protest. But from my understanding, there wasn't too many protests of the Russian diaspora. There was, I know, in Prague. There was one. I know in New York and Brighton Beach there was also one. But
I've seen some on Cyprus with the
Cyprus,
swastikas and that and awful.
Right. So, but still, not. I don't think there was too many kind of like anti-war protests of Russians in different countries. At least I didn't see too many. Maybe I'm wrong in this respect, so I don't want to give some false information here. But I didn't see too many. I know there was in Prague. I know it was in New York, like you said. There was also in Cyprus. You said there was some anti-war protests carried out by Russians. So that's very good.
Not anti-war, but pro-war.
Oh, okay. Okay. So, right. So, yeah. So, exactly. That is very worrisome. So, and I know there was also even a pro-war protest in Germany. It was in the cars, right? So
yeah,
that does worry us here in Poland as well. That there isn't this kind of more outrage, because this is also interesting too. When you look at, for example, other wars that, for example, the West was involved in, namely Iraq. Let's talk about Iraq for a second. There's huge anti-war protests in the United States, in the UK, in Western Europe, huge, like of American citizens, protesting this. I know, again, like I said, I understand that they can't protest in their home country. It's very, very, very difficult. And the ones that did, they're very, very brave. We have to say that. But
that's true.
I would expect that, for example, the ones the Russians in the diaspora living in different countries, that maybe that they would be more vocal about this. And I think that does surprise a lot of people, that there hasn't been too many people who are very vocal.
We would conclude then, together with you, out of what you said, that there's still a vast majority of Russians, either in Russia or in Russia and around the world, who are not against the war.
That's right.
Hence, if you're not against, sorry, but you're supporting, because this is a time when you have to take action. And
that's right.
Knowing that, do you see how Poles have changed relationships with those Russians who are already in Poland? And it's interesting.
I don't know, to that extent, because I don't know about how many Russians live in Poland. I think it's like 50,000. It's not a big group. So in this respect, I can't say, but I could say that generally speaking, yes, Poland's perception of Russia wasn't very, very strong to begin with before the war. Poland was very, very, I think, skeptical of Russia's intentions, and I think we were much more realistic and understanding compared to, like I said, countries in Western Europe. We kind of knew what to expect, but even this crossed the line of anything. And you gave the example of Bucha, and these things, these horrors, these absolute horrible massacres, definitely shook a lot of Poles. I know that for a fact. As far as how the relations with Russians in the country, I can't say, because it's a very small group of people. So I really
Understood.
can't say that.
I'm going to ask you this. So I talked to a journalist in Warsaw, and he said this to me. Imagine in 3 to 4 to 5 years, this 3 to 5 million Ukrainians will remain in Poland.
Mm-hmm.
For some, even after the war is over, they will not come back for various reasons. It takes too much time to rebuild. It's great to live in Poland, let's say, or it's more comfortable for the kids. That's what I hear here in Austria from Ukrainians who are here with kids. Like, there's no reason for us to come back because it's great for kids. But having said that, so in 3 to 5 to 7 years, you'll have 5 million Ukrainians in Poland, and you've had many millions, 2 million before the war, if I'm not mistaken.
Something like that, 1.5, 2 million. It depends on the statistic. Yeah.
So Polish population will increase up 5 million up. Then you'll have a very significant part of society that becomes one of the integral parts of the society that become that could have voting rights, let's say, that could influence the politics, or that could influence or lobby the politicians. And this would become either a problem, or B, an opportunity, or C, a combination of that. And let's get there. Let's talk about this a bit.
Well, that's actually another thing that I failed to mention at the beginning when you said, for example, what are some of the reasons why Poles are helping, why they feel the Ukrainian situation so closely. I didn't mention also the fact that Poles are close to Ukrainians linguistically, culturally, and what have you. I think that's also a very important thing. I forgot to mention that. And from this standpoint, it's also very important because Poles, for example, in Poland in general, there's a problem with demographics to begin with. It's a big problem over the years. The demographic situation has been very flat. Oh gosh, I think for 30 years it's been relatively around that 38, 39 million level, very flat. And this is definitely a problem. And the one way to increase it is immigration, right? For Poles to bring in immigrants rather. Now, it's much easier for Poland to bring in people that have they're similar linguistically, culturally, et cetera, et cetera. So for Poles, this is a very good opportunity, by the way, to deal with the demographics. So that's a very important one. Now, you mentioned that it was 2 million and now it could be another 3 million. That could be, 5 million if that's the case. We don't know, right? We don't know how many Ukrainians will stay. I read different statistics. I read that something around 20% say they will want to stay. The rest will, but we don't know. Longer this drags on, nobody knows. But nonetheless, you're right. It'll be a significant part of the population. They'll get voting rights and what have you. I look at this as a good opportunity, like I said, from a demographic standpoint, from an economic standpoint as well. So these are, I think, good things. And I think that, like I said, it's much easier for Poland to have people what are linguistically similar, culturally similar, that can really easily adapt. Poland's not a country made up of immigrants. I'm Polish Canadian. I grew up in Canada, country of immigrants for immigrants, right? Where everybody is an immigrant there, and they, even if they weren't, for example, born abroad, but maybe their parents or their grandparents, it's completely different than a country like Poland, right? So for Poland to just open the doors for the whole world, I can understand it could be challenging. But in this respect, with regards to the Ukrainians, it's much smoother, and the Ukrainians adapt very well in Poland. And as you know, I'm a university lecturer. I have lots of Ukrainian students, lots of the universities that I lecture at. And by the way, there's been significantly more and more as the years went by. I started lecturing 9 years ago or so, and every year I see more and more Ukrainians. And Ukrainians adapt very well. Again, this is before the war. Ukrainians were adapting very, very well. They're an important part of society, and I think that's going to be the same situation with the Ukrainians that stay. Again, we don't know how many will, but assume that a significant part will.
But having said that, that means that we Ukrainians and Ukraine as a nation, as a country, will be drained, like brain drained in a way, and not only brain drained, but just human force drained. People will not come back, and the amount that they left. That's my hypothesis at this point. I want to check whether you agree with this or not. How do you think?
I think that there's a good chance that may occur. It all depends, for example, on what happens in Ukraine as far as what kind of peace will be there eventually. Because if this will be an ongoing situation, of course, the people will be scared naturally. They'll think that it's a better life to live abroad, obviously, at that point. But if the situation stabilizes, hopefully there'll be a huge recovery plan for Ukraine. And we're talking about like Marshall Plan to the extreme, right?
Yeah.
Then there could be actually lots of opportunities for people going back. Not only for Ukrainians, by the way, it could be a place to bring up a lot of expats. We'll see that it'll be a great place for reconstruction, rebuilding. And the same way, for example, after World War II in Western Europe and in Japan, this could work both ways. But definitely, I agree with you that if the situation, God forbid, if there'll be a situation where there'll be not a real peace, there'll be a kind of always like a so-called frozen conflict. I hate that when people say that, but if there will be something like along those lines, and there'll be elements of war and what have you, then yes, you're absolutely right. There could be an ongoing brain drain where the best and the brightest will think that they don't have a future there, and that's a big risk for Ukraine. That's stated, like I said, that hopefully the war will end on Ukraine's terms, of course, and there will be peace. And in that respect, there could be a gigantic recovery plan for Ukraine. There will be opportunities for Ukrainians and expats and others alike.
Understood. Thanks for that. And by the way, I wanted to, in the last 10, 15 minutes, I wanted to check this. So when the war started, the first few days, you were in shock, I was in shock, plenty of us were
Yeah.
in shock. What was your thinking on the outcome of this war in the first few days?
Okay, so this is also interesting too, that in 2014, when war broke out, I remember a lot of pundits, and this is military experts and what have you. They were saying that Russia is a new army after Georgia in 2008. This is a completely new army. They changed this very very sophisticated army and everything. So I was, quite frankly, I was just really scared based on that. I thought, this is a modern army. I was worried that the West wouldn't react. I worried that the sanctions will be on some officials in Donetsk People's Republic, some like no name people. I thought that was going to be like that. So I was literally worried that the situation could turn really badly. That stated, I always said this. I knew the Ukrainians would fight. I knew that. My friends could attest to the fact that I was always saying that. So I knew that my expectation was, I'll be frank with you, I expected that, yes, Kiev would fall because the media was blowing it up. But I expected at that point that there would be huge partisan warfare. That was my initial feeling, that yes, some of the cities would fall, but there would be an ongoing partisan warfare. But to the surprise of the whole world, Ukraine relatively quickly, pushed back Russia from the north, from Kiev area, and Ukraine won in the north. I frankly didn't expect that. I expected that Ukraine wouldn't be conquered, but I expected that some of the big cities would fall under Russian control, and my expectation was that there would be a partisan warfare.
Understood. And in the course of the war, how did your judgment about this move, and what was the dynamic?
Well, the thing is that the more I saw, for example, that the Ukrainians were fighting back, the more I saw how organized they were. How much, like I said, how the Western world, we got to give the Western world credit too, that this time was different. Yes, they could do more. We've said this. But this is completely different than it was in 2014. In 2014, the Obama administration didn't want to give Ukraine any heavy weapons. That was the thing. So that thing completely changed this time around, and my perception started changing when I started seeing that the Russians were having a difficult time in the north. The Ukrainians were fighting back heroically. That they were regaining territory in the north. And then we started seeing these images of this kind of Russian bumbling army, with these tanks on the side of the road. I remember there's that whole situation where a lot of people were scared. We're on the outside of Ukraine. I don't know if it was on Belarus, also in Russia. There's this huge column of armored
Yeah.
vehicles coming in. Remember, and everybody was scaring that this is going to be the huge main. This is going to be the main attack. This is going to be the main attack hitting Ukraine. And they were stuck there. People didn't realize they had problems with fuel, that their equipment was destroyed, their vehicles were destroyed, and what have you. They couldn't operate. And when they did enter the Ukraine territory, they're getting shot down. They're getting hit hard. So I started feeling much better when I started seeing the situation evolving, how Ukraine was doing very well in the north. That's stated. Now we have a situation in the east, what's escalating, and I do worry about that. My understanding is Ukraine made some very good progress around Kharkiv region. They even at one point reached the border with Russia there. But yeah, I am honestly getting a little bit worried about the situation in the east more, because there's some bad news has been coming out the past few days. But yes, to be honest, the first few days, shock. Then I thought, based on what the media was saying and then pundits were saying, military experts, that Kiev, some big cities might fall and there'll be partisan warfare. To the surprise of everybody, Ukrainian army fought back really hard, and the north is under control, but the east, not really right now.
Well, and with your prediction, what would be your prediction or idea or guess on how the war will evolve further? How much time do you give until some type of peace is arranged?
It's hard to imagine that this will go on for a lot longer. I know that both sides, Ukraine is ready for a long war. Russia is also ready, but again, things like economics do play a big factor here. The question is how long can Russia stay isolated for? My assumption will be that there's going to be a Ukrainian counteroffensive, right? Not counterattack, but counteroffensive on in the coming couple months. We'll see how that turns out. I think that within a half a year that there will be some negotiations, real negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. But again, we can't go back to a situation like it was before. We can't go back to a situation where Russia's just allowed to have some territory, so which really worries me that some people like Henry Kissinger, the article recently by the New York Times, stating these things. That really concerns me. That should be out of the question, any kind of compromise on those grounds. But I do think that in half a year, Russia will be feeling the sanctions much more. Hopefully, this sixth round of sanctions of the European Union will get passed. I know there's a meeting, I think, in 3 days, if I'm not mistaken. I think there should be something passed. Maybe not the full embargo, but they will do something. Russia will be more squeezed from that. I know some people say that or the Russians as well say that, oh, we'll find new clients, we'll trade with China more, but or in India more, but they don't have the same energy needs as Europe does. So, and they'll of course be in a position of strength because they'll know the situation, so they'll be bargaining for cheaper oil prices and gas prices. So, I think that Russia will be squeezed more, the economy will be felt more, and I think in half a year's time there will be real negotiations. But again, we can't go back to the situation that was before.
Understood. Thank you for that. I have a fork question on President Zelensky.
Yeah.
What would you say is his biggest advancement and his worst move since the war has started?
Well, I'll be completely frank with you too, that I was shocked how well he reacted. I didn't expect that. I'll be completely honest with you. That when I heard that in Ukraine they elected a former comedian, a former actor that didn't have political experience, I was a little bit worried, even, to be honest with you. I was absolutely shocked how he didn't give in at all, how he became a true statesman overnight. And I think, to answer your question, what are the strongest sides? I think that because of his experience as an actor, as someone in front of the camera, I think he did a phenomenal job, and he's doing a phenomenal job of getting the message across. And this is actually a very important aspect of the war as well, is the information war. Whereas Russia is big time losing the information war. And I think we have to give big credit right here to Zelensky in that respect. As far as the negatives, I can't say too many negatives because I think he's doing a phenomenal job. One thing, but again, I don't know to what extent this is a negative, but right before the war, that he was a little bit downplaying it. But I don't know if this was, trying to, calm down the situation internally. It's hard for me to say, but I remember that in the lead up to the war, maybe, just maybe, he should have been a little bit more assertive, saying that what it was the intelligence community from the United States and the UK were telling him. But again, when war broke out, it's hard to say that he did anything really wrong, because he also, he brought also back this kind of, which is very important, this message to the Western world and to the world in general, to show what the world could look like if it wasn't, for example, a U.S.-dominated Western world, because there was a lot of negativity towards the West over the years. There's hypocrisy, the wars, but a lot of people forgot that what the other options are like. And I think Zelensky did a fantastic job, and not only Zelensky in general. I think the Ukrainian government did a fantastic job indicating that to the world, stating this to the world, what the situation really looks like. And he galvanized the international community. There's that image of Ukrainians, the heroism of Ukrainians. He did a great job from the PR standpoint, from the information war standpoint, building, great relations with other world leaders. Every day, it seems like he is giving, a speech in front of a parliament around the world. Every day. It's, the intensity, the energy he has, the hope he's giving, not only Ukrainians, but the world, right? He's doing a fantastic job. But yeah, as far as the negative, I can't really say too much. just maybe a couple of days before the war started, that little lead up. But that's just
Understood.
my personal standpoint.
And you mentioned that you've learned about Ukrainians, the courage, the bravery, and the heroism. I was wondering what else have you, Chris Gotowski, learned about how Ukrainians are and how we fight? What have you seen as the part of our DNA that we are, by the way, undergoing, comprehending right now?
Well, honestly, I remember that in 2014, I was saying to a lot of people, I knew that Ukrainians in general were a nation that won't just give up. I always knew that. I think there's again a lot of similarities, like I said before, between Poles and Ukrainians, some historical similarities and what have you. So I knew that the Ukrainians won't just put down their weapons. I knew that, but of course, I think like most people, we're surprised to the extent how the whole nation was involved in this. The whole nation is bringing light to the world. What's happening? The whole country is fighting, and the amount of volunteers, right? Um, Something like 700,000 volunteers registered to fight. So I learned, yeah, I knew about the heroism. I knew that they were courageous. I didn't expect it to be to this extent. I'll put it that way.
Understood. In the end, few things. So that's how you found how you see in Ukrainians right now. And I was wondering to ask you, what is to be a Polish person? What is to be a Pole? Like, if we talked about Ukrainian identity for a moment, now let's see it how you guys have developed your identity and what is the Polish identity.
Well, that's a very difficult question. I think people can have different answers to that, but the Polish identity definitely is at the heart of Europe. Poles are proud Europeans. Poles believe that they're in the Western camp. I think that's very important for Poles to know that and to feel that way. Polish identity, of course, is based on our history and our values. Poles also, like I said, never gave up. There was constantly uprisings, battles. Some maybe weren't very effective. Some were very effective. But I think that identity of always fighting for freedom, never giving up, like I said at the very beginning, in the 1980s, a solidarity movement was created. It was founded here in Poland. It was the first movement like that in the communist part of Europe. So Poles always kind of had this identity of kind of fighting back. Freedom was very always important for Poles, and we don't take it lightly too. Like idea of freedom, independence. We understand. Again, coming back to one of the first questions regarding how Poles perceive the situation in Ukraine, why they're helpful, because this identity of independence and freedom, I think it's very strong in Poland, and we see that it's also very strong in Ukraine right now too.
Mm. Thanks for elaborating that, Chris. I was wondering if it's comparable, and it's really comparable and also overlapping the
Yeah, yeah,
parts of the identity.
exactly.
And in the end, I would probably ask you to give a short, like, you are European. By the way, you're European Canadian, so you're
Yeah, yeah,
Polish Canadian. So you
yeah,
you have a very broad scale of how you see the world, and
yeah.
this is an amazing opportunity for you right now um, to share some thoughts with Ukrainians that would listen to you, and it would be the elevator pitch on, hey guys, hold up and everything. So what would you say to Ukrainians right now?
Well, exactly what you just said. Hey guys, hold up. We're behind you fully, completely fully. We do feel that Ukrainian will succeed. Uh, as Zelensky said, the truth is on Ukraine's side, which is very important. And the truth, it came out, and it will come out in Russia as well, that Ukraine is the one that was attacked. It's fighting for its independence, its freedom. I have I'm definitely I'm positive that in the long run things will work out in Ukraine. And also what's very beautiful is how united Ukraine has become too. So I think that there's no way that Ukraine, for example, will lose that in the long run. And I think that this will be Ukraine will be a success story in the long run. It's going to be a difficult time, nonetheless. It's going to be some tough battles along the way, but I'm 100% sure Ukraine will come out very well out of this. The more money will come in from the European Union, more weapons, and hopefully sooner rather than later, Ukraine will also join the European Union. They'll be part of the same boat as Poland right now. So
That would be a very good result of this.
Yeah.
And the last thing, what would be your message to Europeans? Europeans from various countries with various positions
Yeah.
on this, but what would be your message?
Well, my message would be definitely that to see the situation for what it is. That's number one. Number two, similar to what Zelensky just said yesterday or even today, for the Europeans to stop playing these games. Not to, for example, take into account business and what have you over values. The Europeans talk about values, how important they are. Well, this is a very important moment right now. This is a huge test for Europe, right? Are values really that important, right? Or some doing some gas deals? So for my message to the Europeans is to see the situation for what it is, that it also affects Europe as well, and to really place their values and show what kind of values they have in this context, that the country Ukraine is fighting for its independence, for freedom, for democracy. And if Europe stands for this, which it does, the European Union, it should fully be behind Ukraine in this context.
Thank you, Chris. So my guest today was Chris Gotowski, live from Warsaw. Chris, thank you so much for being our first guest on the series of English podcasts.
Thank you, Andrei. It's been great. It's been great.
All the best to you, and we'll talk later, of course. And thanks a lot for all these words. I'm going to Ukraine. Дякую вам за те, що ви слухали та дивилися нашу першу англомовну серію з частини подкастів англомовних про війну з експертами з різних сфер. Для подкасту «Як ти думаєш». Мій гість сьогодні Кріс Готовський, політичний експерт і викладач з Варшави Лайв. Моє ім'я Андрій Сусленко, і ми почуємося та побачимось далі. Підтримуйте нашу роботу через PayPal. Дякую і до зустрічі. All right, thanks a lot.